if you want to learn how to paint, you have to watch a master paint. You don't just grab the tubes of paint and start doing it yourself with no instruction, right? And so at the Latin Mass, the priest becomes the master and we become the apprentices. And this is just one illustration of many where we see how the traditional Mass, pre-modern, in some ways anti-modern, I would say, is perfectly suited to the needs of modern and postmodern people.
Here we go. Welcome to The Way is Love on the Focusing Way podcast. I'm your host, David Battistella. Find The Focusing Way on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. To access bonus content and extras, subscribe at thefocusingway.com. No matter what time we are living in, we are always living in God's time. Sometimes the future is found in the past. Sometimes we must move toward tradition, a way that we once did things in order to understand what was, and use that new understanding of the old way to shape our future. Long before the New World Order was a catchphrase everyone came to know and somewhat understand, Roman Catholics were dealing with a Latin version of the same phrase. For Roman Catholics in the 1960s, the words Novus Ordo, or New Order, were the two small Latin words that the earthly leadership of the one holy and apostolic Catholic Church of Jesus Christ were floating as the bright and fantastic future of the faith. Before Pope Pius VI presented the Roman Catholic world with his version of a new way to pray, Roman Catholics had been praying a liturgy carefully handed to them through 15 centuries of tradition. The Church moved slowly and carefully for 1,500 years, and it took just 10 years to dismantle it completely. 50 years later, with virtually none of the bold promises fulfilled, fewer vocations, less attendance, and a free-for-all in the liturgy, Catholics are turning back to traditional ways and the liturgy that was practically snatched from their hands. Author Peter Kwasniewski has crafted a detailed account of what happened with compelling and significant arguments helping us piece together what was lost. It helps one understand the depth and profound beauty of the Roman Catholic faith as it was celebrated in the traditional Roman Rite. Here to speak with me about his book is Dr. Peter Kwasniewski. And joining me now is Dr. Peter Kwasniewski. Dr. Peter, thank you for being on the podcast. I really appreciate having you here today.
You're very welcome, David. Thank you for having me.
I want to really just start this with thanking you for taking the time to exhaustively research, in essence, what it means to be a practicing Catholic by understanding exactly where, why, and how our faith was brought down to us. And I've immersed myself in the Latin Mass, and I've experienced many a time when I was reading this book, some of the many parallels with what you experienced. So I just want to let everyone know today we're talking about the Latin Mass, and it seems the only time we hear about the extraordinary form of the Mass is in relation to some negative story about antiquated Catholics. But can you explain with a brief overview the significant changes the Church witnessed in the 1960s?
Yes, that's a mighty tall order, but I think we can probably helpfully summarize it by saying that there had been a spirit in the Church, especially in the 1950s and 60s, of what you might call effervescent reform, a sort of fervor to update and to modernize, on the assumption that modern Western people, no longer had the qualities or dispositions or abilities to appreciate some kind of ancient, contemplative, meandering, dense prayer form, such as the traditional Latin liturgy was and is. And in a way, I actually think this is a kind of despairing attitude, because it sort of suggests that modern man is so deracinated, so uprooted from his past, from his human nature, even his very humanity, from his conceptual and symbolic ability, that he's just sort of hopeless. He's like some kind of dwarf, a mental invalid, and so we need to create a sort of abbreviated, simplified ritual for him that will be instantly comprehensible, easy to pick up, easy to navigate through, almost, this sounds insulting, I don't mean it to be, but almost like a drive-through, like something very, that would just give him immediately the goods that he's looking for. And that spirit was in the air, and that was very much the thinking of the liturgical reformers. They tended to be rationalists who reduced participation to understanding instantly and making responses to it, which of course is a very primitive understanding of participation. I mean, that's that's like the lowest and simplest level of it. So I think when you take into account this mentality, then you can understand a lot of the particular changes that were made, putting the liturgy into the vernacular, and not an elevated vernacular like the King's English of the Book of Common Prayer or Church Slavonic, but a very low grade, vernacular, turning the priest around so that people can see him and interact with him, in a kind of tete-a-tete, right? Making the prayers shorter and simpler, and removing things from the prayers that are uncomfortable to modern people, like mentions of hell or mentions of mortification, or of the priority of the kingdom of heaven over earthly concerns, or miracles and apparitions, right? So the liturgy is sort of both simplified and naturalized, and and sort of conformed to modern expectations. And of course, without getting too far ahead of myself, the problem with doing that is that you're essentially then trapping modern people in their modernity. You're not giving them any opportunity to escape from the socio-cultural conditions that they're already immersed in, right? And that's one of the great things, one of the reasons I think that the discovery of the traditional Latin liturgy has been so transformative for so many of us, is that we suddenly feel like we're being carried out of ourselves, carried out of our age, carried out of our assumptions and our presuppositions and our understanding of the world. We are challenged by it, right?
Yes,
and
absolutely.
We need that.
Yeah. So what has your experience been with people who've experienced the Novus Ordo Mass? Basically, everyone who's been raised after 1970, which let's just call that the new Mass. And then what's the difference when they are experiencing, from what you're hearing from them, the richness of the Roman Rite, which I will call the future Mass?
Yes. It's not even what I hear from people, although I do in chapter 1 in particular, I give a whole bunch of testimonials from people, which can be easily multiplied, and you can find other ones online. But I don't even have to give the testimonies from other people, because I myself, being born in 1971, grew up in a very straightforward, liberal New Jersey parish, covered with carpet and extraordinary ministers, I sang in the youth choir with the piano and the guitars, and all that stuff. I didn't know any better. I didn't know anything.
Sure.
I was just simply, that's where I was. That's where God put me. And I think he put me there for a reason. I'm very grateful to the Lord for the journey I've had, because I've seen it all.
Yeah.
And when I argue for the superiority of the traditional rite, it's not because it was somehow, branded into me from the time I was a baby. No, I had to discover it as a young adult and fall in love with it. I had to go through all the same mental processes that other Catholics do, like what in the world is going on? I'm so confused. I have no idea, what the priest is saying. I'm lost. I can't follow this missal. What's going on? And then later, why did they take this away from me? Or from us? Like the sort of anger that you feel once you actually get past that, if I could put it this way, once you enter into Narnia, through the wardrobe, right, you sort of enter through the traditional mass into a wonderful supernatural world that you never even realized existed. And then you're thinking, why did they take this away from us? What were they thinking? But I think what, the experiences are generally of, you find people say things like, I went to the traditional Latin Mass, and for the first time, I learned how to pray. It taught me how to pray.
Yeah.
How to lift up my mind and heart to God in a deep way.
Yeah.
There are other people who say, I went there and I realized for the first time that the Mass is not about me. It's not about the community. It's about God and his mystery, into which we're all incorporated, into which we're all drawn. So it is about us, but it's about us indirectly. We're sort of scooped up into something greater and taken with it. Other people say, I never realized that the Mass was a sacrifice. Maybe I heard that said because it's still dogmatically the case. It's always the case whenever the consecrations take place. That's a symbolic representation of the passion of our Lord, and his death is made present to us in mystery. But that always happens, but you don't really see it in a modern Mass that's celebrated like a meal, and with a lot of kind of back and forth, bonhomie, and the music and the ambiance is, at worst, it's the ambiance of a show or an entertainment.
Yes.
And at best, it's the ambiance of a Protestant prayer service, where we're saying pious things, undoubtedly and sincerely. But the idea that this is some kind of like earth-shattering moment in which heaven and earth are commingled in the once-for-all sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross. That's what kind of leaps out at you from the traditional Mass and hits you over the head. Right?
Yeah, and it doesn't lose that importance if from week to week. There's nothing mundane about it once you've understood that mystery and you begin to enter into it. From my own personal experience, it was the silence. Yes. It was the ability to pray, and then to learn that I place my prayers on that altar, and there's a holy priest offering that on this sacrificial altar, representing Calvary in that way. It was just such a powerful experience, and I've sort of described myself as a malformed Catholic. It really brought me into wanting to understand and know more about the other sacraments, and there's so much of that inside it. And
yes. Now here's one way I like to think about the traditional liturgy of the Church, and I think you can see this especially in the Mass, but you also see it in the other sacramental rites and in the divine office, in their traditional forms. But I think of it almost as if the worship of the Church is always going on. It's going on forever, in the past and in the future and in the present. And it's like a stream, like a rushing torrent, right? And you step into it, or you're caught up into it. You enter, you sort of penetrate for a moment into this sphere of saturated prayer, right? That's the liturgy. And then you come out of it again, but it's still going on,
Yes.
And so it's not this sort of discrete human event or meeting that we're in charge of, and we run it according to a certain agenda. It's like, here's our agenda of business. We're going to have a greeting, and then we're going to have some readings, and then we're going to have a reflection, and we sing some songs.
Very
and then
bankerly,
right? Yeah, it's not like that at all. You have the sense that like when the Latin Mass starts, it sort of emerges out of the eternal silence, and then merges back into the eternal silence. And
beautiful description.
And that, for me, it's such an amazing thing to be immersed in prayer like that, to be immersed in the prayer of the Church, the prayer of the priest, the prayer of everybody around me, this saturated prayer. And I'm not saying, again, that you don't have praying happening in the Novus Ordo, but there's a difference in the atmosphere. There's a difference in the atmosphere, and that has an explanation. That has a rational explanation. It's not just about intentions, or if people had better intentions, things would be better. It's about the fact that, for example, in the traditional liturgy, as I explained in one of my chapters, there are layers upon layers of action and prayer going on at the same time, right? and different people are doing different things, and the lay people have no regimented role. They just do whatever they do. There are customs that we follow, so that it's not completely chaotic. But basically, everybody is just thrown into the deep end, and we're all supposed to swim at the same time. It's disconcerting at first, especially if you're used to this more agenda-like meeting approach. But it's disconcerting. But then it becomes relaxing, and then it becomes rejuvenating. Then you're sort of like, oh, you can breathe freely, like, oh, this isn't on me after all. It's like, I don't know, it's such a hard thing. It's such a paradox.
I heard a beautiful thing this past Sunday in a sermon, which was the comparison to the tempio, the word tempio, which actually entering the temple meant it was a reference to time, and you're entering into God's time and space.
Yes.
And no one should never look at a watch when you're inside the temple, because you've entered a different time and space, another dimension, if it were.
Yes.
And there's some sort of beauty that gets transmitted through this silence. And if one is patient enough to be with that, then that becomes the place where we can interact with the Holy Spirit, where we can feel the presence of the holy angels. We can really feel everything building up to that sacrifice, to that raising of the chalice and our Lord, and the moments of consecration gives it a kind of reverence that I had not seen often. I've been in quote unquote serious masses with important people, but rarely with that sort of reverence that comes in the day to day of this liturgy.
Yes. Yeah. And again, I think, as I said before, there are reasons for these experiences we have. One of the reasons behind this spirit of total reverence, this wraparound reverence, is that every single motion of the priest is scripted. And all of the ministers. If you're at a solemn mass, the deacon, the subdeacon. If you're at a high mass or low mass, the servers. All of the motions that they have are scripted. And so far from producing a robotic effect, which is what somebody might think if they don't experience it, what it ends up doing is it produces what some people have called a sacred dance.
Yeah.
It's a sort of sacred choreography where everyone is taking on a role that's larger than himself, and is acting it out in a manner that is stylized and isn't just that person's way of doing things. It's not idiosyncratic. It's not the personalities of the individuals involved recede into the distance. They disappear. The priest disappears. The server disappears. The ad orientem orientation helps a great deal in that respect.
Yeah.
And so the fact that the priest's hands and postures and gestures and where his feet are, how he walks, where he puts his eyes is all scripted for him means that he eventually becomes so facile and so accomplished at doing this that it has a gracefulness, a naturalness that carries everyone, the priest himself and all the people who are praying, right to God, right? There's no interference of the individual human agents, right?
Yeah.
And what's weird is that in the new mass, even when you have a very reverent priest, it ends up looking like a priest making an effort to be reverent, because there are so few rubrics and there's so little for him to do, comparatively speaking, to the traditional rite, that he almost has to take charge of making the mass reverent, because it's kind of lacking in a lot of respects. And so I guess there's something so fluid and fluent and natural about the traditional mass that the regimentation actually leads in an opposite direction to what we might think. It leads to freedom, to a great interior freedom to pray.
So many people describe this, and people who are traditional Catholics, as rigid. And what you're describing is the exact opposite experience, that something becomes fluid, a beautiful. And I think I heard somewhere recently that in the low mass, which lasts about half an hour to 35 minutes, sometimes 40, the priest actually has over 500 specific actions in that time. that's passed down from generation to generation. That is, those are precious, precious things. And from the moment they leave the sacristy to when they return to the sacristy. So it's beautiful from so many different perspectives. But I just want to ask you, because the title of your book is an entire blend of faith, hope, and charity, in the sense that it states that the Roman rite of the Mass is the future of the Catholic faith. How firmly do you believe that?
Yes. I mean, of course, right now, if you look at the situation in the church, what you see is something in between anarchy and scandal, and, constant sexual abuse, financial abuse. The synodal process is, in my opinion, the most Orwellian thing that I've ever seen. It's such a twisted process. It has prefixed goals that are going to be reached by prefixed means, all under the auspices of participation and openness and all these sorts of things. That's why I call it Orwellian. So, I mean, if you look at the situation of the church right now, it could seem to be the worst it ever has been in some respects. And I think that's true. Also, if you take into account sacramental participation in Western countries is just has been declining and declining and declining. It's entered in some places into single digits, right?
Yeah.
So if you look at the situation, you might say, oh, this is it. It's over, game over. Well, no, but see, what I experience is a tremendous hunger among younger people, younger generations, for meaning, for authenticity, for tradition, right? And I think you don't get meaning and authenticity apart from tradition. I'm completely with Alistair McIntyre on that point, right? So there are young people, if they still believe, or if they still want to believe or want to find meaning in life, they are being drawn to traditional sources and traditional practices. This, incidentally, it cuts across all religions. I mean, this explains also the growth of Islam, incidentally. We can, that's a whole separate question. But the most disciplined, conservative, demanding forms of religion are the ones that are growing in the world.
Yeah.
Okay? And the ones that are wishy-washy, compromise with the world, taking on secular morality and so on, they are dying.
Yeah.
And that's because they've signed their own death sentence. So when I travel a lot, I go all over the world giving talks on the liturgy and so forth. I'm everywhere I go, I meet seminarians and clergy and young people and young families, and they all are hungry for these things.
Yeah.
And they tell me stories like, we're the only ones practicing in our village, or in our city, the most active parish is the one run by the Fraternity of St. Peter, or whatever.
Right.
So when I say the future, this is the future, I'm not saying it's going to be an easy victory and that it's going to happen next week or next year. But what I mean is that the trajectory is there towards the rediscovery and the recovery of our authentic tradition as Catholics, including most especially the liturgical heritage. And I think that's true, because the generation that's pushing things like the synod on synodality, this kind of weird Hegelian, self-absorbed, reverie, that is like the last gasp of a dying generation of dinosaur progressives, Vatican II hippies, I call them, and when they go down, all that stuff is going down. Yeah. Nobody cares about that among, serious Catholics.
As I read the book, I had some profound moments of sadness when I really began to understand the whole process of transformation of the Roman Catholic Mass that occurred from the 50s and in the 60s. And it felt to me almost as though much of the poetry was being carved away. What's poetic, what we've been talking about. And it's like kind of what we ended up with was Cole's notes of a Shakespeare play or a Dante for Dummies book. I don't want to reduce it to that, but I want to give the essence that things have been distilled down to the bare minimum. What was your sense when you began to uncover these truths, when you really started to look at them?
Yeah, no, that's a really really penetrating question. I will say there are definitely times in my life when studying these issues as I have, I've just been profoundly scandalized by things that I've discovered, and not just saddened, but almost tempted to despair. I mean, that is to say, it's it's much worse than people realize. I have a chapter in another book of mine that has the title, "No matter how bad you think the corruption is, it's worse." Okay, this is the name of one of the chapters I have. And so it is true, it's demoralizing when you look into it. And so we have to be very careful, first of all, to know our limits. Like with drinking, they always say that about, if you're going to drink and drive, know your limits. Right?
Yeah,
so
yeah.
If you're going to drink, as it were, about the history of the modern church in the 20th century and what it did and what the churchmen did, really the churchmen, not the church, the Immaculate Bride of Christ, then you need to have a sense of what your toleration level is. And you have to have a very strong prayer life to combat the feelings that you're going to have. If you're praying the rosary, if you're praying some part of the divine office, if you're able to get to the Latin Mass, those things are, I call them at one point, they're like superfoods, like the organic, the organic grocery advocates are always talking about superfoods, well, they nourish us in a supremely efficacious way.
Yeah.
I think that I was able to fight the spiritual battles precisely because of the traditional practices that I have centered my life around, or structured my life around. But I think it's still important that we do this digging, that we find out, in a sense, we have to look at, it's a little bit like looking at death. Like in the tradition of the church, we have memento mori, right?
Yeah.
All the churches of Europe are full of skulls and crossbones.
Remember
right?
death.
This is not because people were macabre. It was because they just wanted us, not to sort of go through life superficially, forgetting about the fact that we will meet our Maker. We don't know when. He will come at an hour and a day and a time when you don't know. So be ready, be ready. And so similarly, I think we have to confront full on what was done to the liturgy and how specious and worse, and how illogical and unconvincing and counterproductive were the reasons given for all of the things that were done. And that's what this book does a lot of that, as you know. It digs deeply into the flawed motives and reasonings of the reformers. But it also, I hope, it also has the positive message of, this is what is right about the traditional liturgy. Yeah. Here's why it's a good thing for it to have all of these features that it has.
There was definitely an urgency, and I'm just going to read this quote from the book, but it's actually a quote that you discovered of Pope Paul VI, who is the Pope that issued in many of these changes. Mm-hmm. He says, quote, "We must prepare for this many-sided inconvenience. It's the kind of upset caused by every novelty that breaks in on our habits. We shall notice that pious persons are disturbed most because they have their own respectable way of hearing Mass, and they will feel shaken out of their usual thoughts and obliged to follow those of others. Even priests may feel some annoyance in this respect. This novelty is no small thing. We should not let ourselves be surprised by the nature or even the nuisance of its exterior forms," close quote. What did you think about, why did they have this urgency to make this all happen when it happened?
It's an astonishing quote, isn't it?
It is.
That's Paul VI talking in November of 1969. I forget if it's November 19th or 26th, which one it is, but one of those two dates. He was giving these final two addresses before the Novus Ordo Mass was supposed to come into force the following Sunday, the first Sunday of Advent, 1969. And he's trying to give a defense. And the amazing thing, I have a whole chapter, as you know, about this, about these speeches. The amazing thing is, it's an awful defense. It's a terrible defense. He would never make a good salesman, you know? he's trying to sell you a product and saying, this product that I'm about to show you right now, it has all kinds of nuisances and difficulties associated with it. You're going to have a hard time using it. It's not going to work. You're not going to think it works as well as the old thing. But let me assure you, it had to be done. It had to be done.
Yeah.
Well, what he says in that address, in those addresses, is that the church is driven by a missionary imperative to reach modern man. That's a simple. That is it. There's no real explanation of that. Modern man, whoever that is, whatever that is considered to be somebody who is impatient, intolerant of long and complex ceremonies,
not capable,
not unwilling to be culturally elevated and intellectually challenged. In a certain sense, it almost seems as if modern man here means either unbelievers or wavering believers, or certainly not the pious people who are already hearing Mass, as he talks about, right? The people who are devoutly attending Mass, they don't seem to be the ones for whom the liturgical reform was intended, right?
Right.
So in a bizarre sort of way, it seems as if he wants to create a liturgy for the unchurched, or for the barely churched, or for the ignorant, or for the wavering, or something, and somehow thinks that by coming to the lowest common denominator with them, that he'll scoop them up and take them with.
It's got that banker feeling of like, grow your customer base.
Yes.
That kind of... I don't want to reduce, and I want to be careful myself.
Sure.
I don't want to reduce it to these things, but there's moments where you're going, well, this doesn't. It just, as an example, can you share the story about what happened to the plaque in Ognissanti Church in Rome, where they started to first do this Mass in vernacular Italian? Yeah.
I mean, the fact is that when you research the history of the liturgical reform, what you discover pretty quickly is that most people didn't like it. They didn't want it. The laity had never asked for it. I mean, a tiny minority of lay people are always going to be agitating for reforms, just like a minority of clergy are going to be doing the same thing. But the vast majority of clergy were not asking for it, and the vast majority, even vaster, of laity were certainly not asking for the Mass to be changed, for the priest to be turned around, for Latin to be gotten rid of, for chant to be gotten rid of. They never asked for any of these things. They wouldn't have wanted them. And we have great records, great records. I've published a lot of these things on New Liturgical Movement. For instance, letters of poor Catholics, just regular Catholics, confused, desperate, disillusioned, sending letters to Cardinal Heenan in England saying, what is going on? Why are all these changes happening to our beloved Mass, right?
Yeah.
And Cardinal Heenan says, it's kind of pathetic, but he will write something in the mid-60s like, well, don't worry, those are all the changes that will happen. It will stop soon. And of course, it didn't stop soon. It just kept getting worse and worse and worse, until the complete makeover of 1969. And so, there's a real actual, how shall I put it, a disdain for the opinions and views of the common man. And Joseph Ratzinger says the same thing. One thing, people often criticize me for being too radical. They say, oh, you're much too radical on these. I say, look, every one of my fundamental positions can be found in Joseph Ratzinger, right?
Yeah.
Some of my conclusions that I draw are not found in him. I try to draw what I think are the logical conclusions from the principles that I have found in Ratzinger. But Ratzinger himself says, for example, the liturgical reform ignored the needs and desires of common faithful, of the ordinary faithful. And that's part of the reason why there was such a crisis after the reform. And that's basically the reason why there was a traditionalist movement born. The traditionalist movement was not a bunch of rebellious people. It was exactly the opposite. It was the Catholics who were not rebellious, who said, we don't want this completely new, this novelty, that, as Paul VI called it. This novelty offends our sensibilities as Catholics. It's in rupture from the way that all of our forefathers have prayed. And therefore, they were the opposite of rebels. They were precisely the most faithful, the most observant, the most diligent, the most loving Catholics who were most shocked by these things. And the fact that they wouldn't give up their heritage is exactly what led Paul VI initially, very minimally, and then John Paul II more generously, and Pope Benedict XVI most generously, to say, okay, you know what? These people have a point. They actually do have a point.
Yeah.
And we're going to meet them halfway at least.
Yeah.
But anyway, you asked about Ogni Santi. It's a funny little story. So in 1965, Paul VI celebrated the first vernacular mass. Now, this is an astonishing thing to think about. The first official time in the history of the church from the 4th century. Yeah. The first time since the 4th century that Mass was celebrated in a vernacular language in the sphere of the Latin Rite Church, where Latin had been used all those centuries. So he said Mass in Italian for everything but the canon. The Roman canon remained in Latin. And he also said it facing the people. Okay. Well, this was celebrated in the L'Osservatore Romano, the Vatican newspaper, as a great moment of the liturgical reform moving forward. We have to remember this is just after Vatican II,
right?
Or actually, it was right. Let's see, what had been so right before the last session of Vatican II. But the people were not at all enthusiastic about it. And so when the Vatican put up a plaque in the foyer of Ogni Santi Church, commemorating this great event, it was defaced. It was that people put graffiti on it.
They vandalized it. Yeah.
They vandalized it. And so then they put another plaque in, and that one got vandalized too. So then they finally put the plaque really high up on the wall so that people couldn't reach it. And that's where it stayed. That's where it stands today.
Wow. It's amazing. And many promises were made at that time. And one of the fundamental promises that was being made or insisted upon was that the Mass is essentially the same. It's the same Mass. It's the Roman Mass. Yet you claim, and I don't know how you came up with the figure, I'm curious, but you claim that only about 13% of the Latin Mass remains in the Novus Ordo Mass. So what does this mean in terms of Catholicism that is currently being passed down to Catholics?
Yes. Well, we have to be very careful about what we're talking about. So The 13% figure is about a specific aspect of the Missal. It's about what are called the orations. That's the fancy term for it. But the orations would be the 3 pivotal prayers of the Mass: the collect, the secret, and the post-communion, which were subsequently called the opening prayer, the prayer over the gifts, and the prayer after communion. So these are 3 pivotal prayers of the Roman Rite. And these prayers the core of these prayers is very ancient. The earliest written sacramentaries we have contain lots and lots of these orations. There were always more orations in existence than ever found their way at one point into any missal. It's a large corpus of material. But the Missale Romanum of 1570, codified, canonized by Pope Pius V, based on earlier missals. So he didn't create that missal; he just codified a particular edition of it. All the way down to 1962, the last Auditio Typica of John the 23rd, right on the verge of Vatican II. If you look at the orations in that missal tradition, and then you compare them to the orations in the new missal, so-called Roman missal, only 13% of the old orations were preserved intact in the new missal. Then there's another chunk, I forget the exact figure, where the prayers were retained but heavily redacted, modified, rewritten, combined, edited in various ways. And then you have a very large number, over 50%, that were just simply canceled out, just down the memory hole. They don't exist anymore.
Yeah.
Wow. Now that is shocking. That's an appalling fact. And this is not me or anybody else making up numbers. This is based on detailed textual research done by Matthew Hazel. It's all published online at New Liturgical Movement. Every single detail is proved with all the pie charts, all the numbers, everything. This is not made up. This is just fact.
Yeah.
Right. So what does that tell us about the attitude of the reformers, the liturgical reformers? What does that tell us about their arrogance towards 1,600 years of preceding liturgical tradition, over which they placed themselves as judges, as the measure? We are the measure of what is allowed to pass through our filter and now to reach Catholics. Only 13% apparently of how our forefathers prayed in the orations is now acceptable to modern man, right? I mean, it's this kind of thing. When you hit that, you realize, okay, we're dealing here with two different rites. They have some overlap, like a Venn diagram, with just a little area, a common area in between.
Yeah.
But it's two different rites with a small overlap. And one of the things is, in one of the important chapters in this book is chapter 5, where I talk about the two forms of the so-called two forms, ordinary and extraordinary. Mm-hmm. And I asked the question, are these really two forms of the same thing, or are these just two different things with generic resemblances? And my answer is they're two different things. They're two different rites. And what I'm really trying to do here is give a detailed proof of the claim made by Klaus Gamber all the way back in the 70s, that there's the Ritus Romanus, that is the traditional Roman rite, and then there's the Ritus Modernus, the modern rite of Paul VI. And he made that claim, and he gave some generic reasons for it. But I'm trying to give the blow by blow account. And I'll just mention, if you'd like, I can just quickly list what some of these traits are.
Yes, and just before you do that, though, sure. I would like you to tell me who wrote the Roman Rite and who wrote the Novus Ordo.
Yes, right. Yes. No, it's a very good question. It's reminiscent of the question that many Catholic apologists have asked of Protestants, namely, okay, Lutherans, who founded your church? Well, Martin Luther, right? Okay, Anglicans, who founded your church? Henry VIII. What about you, Presbyterians? Oh, John Knox or Wesley. Anyway, but who is it who founded any particular Protestant sect? Well, there is somebody historically from whom it derives. And prior to that time, that year, it didn't exist as such, right? And the people who joined it prior to that time were Catholics, because the Catholic Church was the only church, for the first 1,000 years of Christianity. And of course the tragic Great Schism between East and West, that's a whole separate can of worms. I don't want to get into that right now. Although I think something similar can be said about the Eastern Orthodox schisms, that they also have individuals to whom they can be traced, right? Who broke off from the Catholicity of the Church of Christ. So similarly, in the area of the liturgy, right? If you ask who is the founder of the Catholic Church, the answer is Jesus Christ, and he founded it on the apostles. Similarly, if you ask who wrote the traditional Roman rite, there's no answer to that question. It wasn't St. Gregory the Great. It already existed before Gregory the Great came to it. He augmented it. He made some revisions to it. Popes throughout the ages have added this or that to the Roman rite. It's a collective enterprise. It's like an artwork with many, many artists who work together and collaborate over many lifetimes, over many centuries. But it wasn't written by Gregory the Great. It preexisted him. It wasn't even written by Pope St. Damasus. We don't even know precisely what Pope St. Damasus did, but we know that whatever he did, it was going to be in continuity with what came before, even if the language shifted from Greek to Latin. So basically what we have to say is the Roman Rite, and all traditional liturgical rites, by the way, are like this, the Byzantine and so forth. It's like that pearl that forms inside the oyster. It starts with a grain that is deposited there by Christ, and then it grows over time into the pearl, right? And it's not anyone's property or anyone's product, right? But as with the Lutherans, the Calvinists, if you say, who wrote the Novus Ordo, you can give a whole list of answers. It was this scholar and this expert and this peritus and this, liturgist and this other bureaucrat and so on and so forth. It's the whole list is right there. You just have to get Annibale Bonini's book.
Yeah.
And just look at the table after table after table of all the experts who drew up to use this horrible expression. They
Right.
drew up the rite for baptism. They drew up the rite for confirmation. They drew up a new rite for holy orders, right? Sure, of course they raided the vaults and the archives for material. They didn't make it all up. They weren't fiction writers.
Yeah.
They didn't make it all up. They got their materials here and there and everywhere, but it was a smorgasbord, and they were the ones who put together, the platter, right?
Yeah.
And so in a unique way in church history, the Novus Ordo has human authorship in a way that it has a definite, specific, time-bound,
Yeah.
ideology-ridden authorship,
Yeah.
right? Which can't be said of the traditional Roman Rite. The traditional Roman Rite bears the marks of every century through which it's passed.
Yeah.
And that's one of the qualities that Ratzinger praises about it,
Yeah.
is he says it's like a great big rambling mansion with lots and lots of rooms that were built at different times and decorated at different times, is not completely coherent, but that doesn't matter. We love it because it's the family mansion, and we've been living in this for centuries and centuries, right? And you almost get like the whole history of the family by walking through this mansion and seeing, oh, okay, that part was built in the Middle Ages. This part was built in the Renaissance. This part was built in the Baroque period. This part was built more recently, and it's,
That
anyway,
becomes what the mystical body is in some way,
Yes.
and then we participate in that. And there's a whole, I'll let you, I will ask you a question about, just in terms of all of the saints who prayed this mass and this is what they were participating in. These are the words, the actions, and the masses that brought them to their sanctity. And somehow participating in that today as a modern person isn't going to bring you to that sanctity or something.
It makes no sense at all if you actually believe that human beings are the same, fundamentally the same in every era, which we are. I'm a composite of body and soul. My soul is in the image of God. My body, in a certain derivative sense, is also in the image of God. I'm a social and political animal. I've been redeemed by Jesus Christ. I mean, tell me I have 5 senses. I have an imagination. Tell me, what is it about me as a modern person that's any different from any other human being who has ever lived? Okay. Well, if I'm essentially the same, sure, there are problems that modern people have that perhaps earlier generations didn't have. We might need crutches and aids and helps that earlier generations didn't have, because I tend to think that earlier generations of people were healthier and more sane than modern people are. Mm-hmm. But still, essentially, we are all human beings, fallen human beings, redeemed, and the same symbolic vocabulary, the same smells and bells, as it were, still speak to us. They still speak to our hearts and minds. And so in that sense, if you actually really believe that the unbroken liturgical tradition of the Roman Catholic Church suddenly ceased to be accessible to men in the 20th century, then I think you're committed to some kind of bizarre position, like the human essence has changed. Like we're a different species now. And that sounds like transhumanism to me. Yeah. I don't know what else you can call it. But if you reject that point, then of course the whole case falls apart for radically revamping the liturgy. And of course the case falls apart. What's the word I want? It falls apart empirically because of all of the young people who are flocking to the traditional Latin Mass nowadays. They have no problem with it, evidently, right? Yeah. But anyway.
We've seen it. We've seen people complaining about young people that want to dress in black and wear a cassock and learn the traditional ways of this faith and to become holy priests in that way. And just the shock on certain people's faces that any young person would ever want to do any such a thing. And it's quite...
See, the people who are surprised about that, they just need to get out more and talk to more people and find out what is it that today's 20-something and 30-something year olds are looking for. They're looking for stability, for authenticity, for meaning, for reality, right? I mean, that is these poor young adults, especially, have grown up in a world where their elders have broken all kinds of commitments,
Yeah.
where they've been deserted, they've been orphaned, they've been manipulated, they've been lied to, right? I mean, if they have any sanity left and any faith left, they are looking for something radically different from what the boomer generation, so-called, has to offer them, right?
Yeah.
And so it's not surprising that this age-old, really immemorial, um, uh, you know, richly elaborate ceremonial expression of the deepest mysteries of the Catholic faith is going to appeal to them. It is so utterly real. It's so utterly objective. It is what it is. It's like rock. It's like solid rock. You know,
Yeah.
you can't break it. All you can do is rest upon it. You know, and
There's a beautiful quote I have right here of Pope Benedict from your book, where he says, quote, he wrote these words in 2009. So it's really not that long ago. Quote, "In our days, when in vast areas of the world, the faith is in danger of dying out like a flame which no longer has fuel, the overriding priority is to make God present in this world and to show men and women the way to God. Not just any God, but the God who spoke on Sinai, to that God whose face we recognize in a love which presses to the end," quote from John 13:1, "in Jesus Christ, crucified and risen. The real problem at this moment of our history is that God is disappearing from the human horizon, and with the dimming of the light which comes from God, humanity is losing its bearings, with increasingly evident destructive effects," close quote.
Mhm.
It's right there for us.
Yes, yes, and what he says about making the presence of God available, or making the presence of God felt, making it accessible to people. The most remarkable thing is that the traditional Roman liturgy does that. It makes the presence of God palpable,
Mm.
precisely in a way by ignoring people, by not trying to. It kind of ignores the people who are present,
Yeah.
because it's so caught up with and so preoccupied with celebrating the sacred mysteries. And so the great paradox, there are so many paradoxes about the traditional liturgy, and I hope that I've in this book that I've done justice to some of those paradoxes.
Oh,
But
yeah.
one of the paradoxes is that the more that the liturgy sort of pays attention to the congregation and panders to them and tries to activate them, the less effective it is. The less people want to be involved, the more
Yeah.
bored they are. But the more the liturgy focuses on God and on his transcendent, awesome mystery, which is enhanced by what I call the sonic iconostasis of silence, Latin, and Gregorian chant.
Yeah.
Right? That the more we focus on God, the more we are enraptured and drawn out of ourselves and energized and engaged. Right? We need to be engaged by something greater than ourselves, something outside of ourselves, something that we can orient ourselves to.
Mm.
And be magnetically drawn by, right? And so in this wonderful paradox, it's so, for instance, the sacerdotalism of the old rite, the fact that so much is centered on the priest and so much
Yeah.
depends on the priest, isn't to the exclusion of the congregation, the faithful. On the contrary, it's precisely when we see the priest so deeply engaged with what he's doing that we become deeply engaged with what he's doing and what we're doing, right?
Yeah.
So it's almost like if you want to watch a master, if you want to learn how to paint,
Yeah.
you have to watch a master paint. You don't just grab the tubes of paint and start doing it yourself with no instruction, right? And so at the Latin Mass, the priest becomes the master and we become the apprentices. And this is just one illustration of many where we see how the traditional Mass, pre-modern, in some ways anti-modern, I would
Yeah.
say, is perfectly suited to the needs of modern and postmodern people.
One thing I love about the Roman Missal is that this one book that any Catholic can easily have with them everywhere they go, they can follow it, and that one book can last my lifetime. It can be passed down year to future generations. But now you would need 4 physical books to accomplish this. And so by taking that missile out of people's hands, in a sense, people would also need to know whether we're in liturgical year A, B, C, or D. Just that fact that each Catholic could just have that calendar in their hand and count on it year to year, and deepen their faith with that book, which is so rich. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, I mean, you're right. So the one volume daily missal that I carry around with me, my preferred edition is the St. Andrew's Daily Missal from 1948, which is still in print, or rather was republished and is available. This one book is it's the one volume summary or summa of the Catholic faith, right?
Yeah.
And just the daily routine and the yearly routine of going through the prayers of the Mass, the antiphons, the orations, the readings, the hymns, the ordinary of the Mass. It's so rich. It's so nourishing. It's just inexhaustible. And the part of the reason it has those strengths is because it's fixed and unchanging, and you get to rely on it. And the thing is this, right? There's such a ridiculous idea out there that we need variety in order to be educated. No, the opposite is true. We need sameness. I mean, we need a certain amount of variety. That is, it wouldn't, if you did the exact same thing every day, you wouldn't probably, you'd run out of what you could derive from it. But if you have a liturgical cycle of Sundays that covers 1 year, that's enough variety that you're always stimulated, you're always seeing new things, but it's enough sameness that you can keep coming back to the same thing and sort of cut the groove deeper, dig deeper into the same thing, see facets that you didn't see before, and most importantly of all, remember it. We need to memorize. The things that are most important to us, we memorize, or we should memorize, right? We all have to memorize the alphabet at some point. We all have to memorize our social security number. Well, in centuries past, people memorized vast amounts of stuff in oral cultures, right? They memorized epics. They memorized lots of poetry, right? And so one of the beautiful pre-modern aspects of the Old Missal is that it's kind of designed for remembrance and for that kind of what did they call it? In the Middle Ages, they talked about Lectio Divina, about chewing on scripture and like chewing the cud almost of scripture, right? And you had to keep chewing it, and you had to almost regurgitate it. I mean, St. Bernard of Clairvaux says this. He's quite graphic about it, And so like you'll never learn anything if you're shifting so much and you have so much ground to cover that you can't really remember it and hold it in your mind, right? And so this is the way in which the ancient liturgy is the perfect platform for all other devotions, all other forms of prayer and theology. It's like that anchor that holds you to the central and most important things.
We talked about a lot of the changes earlier, and you dedicate a chapter to 2 Latin words, Mysterium Fidei, 2 beautiful words spoken over the chalice. And these words and the meaning behind their placement were just omitted. But we live in a words matter kind of culture. Can you explain what happened to these words?
Yes. Yeah. So Mysterium Fidei is a phrase that the priest says sotto voce, of course, because he's doing the canon silently. He says these words sotto voce right in the middle of the consecration of the chalice. So what he says particularly, I'll quote it here. He says, get this right here. He says, Hic est enim calix sanguinis mei, novi et aeterni testamenti mysterium fidei. Qui pro vobis et pro multis effundetur in remissionem peccatorum. So right in the midst of the formula of the consecration of the precious blood is this very inscrutable, mysterious phrase, right? Mysterium fidei, the mystery of faith. Why is it there? Well, nobody really knows. I mean, that is to say, there are lots of theories, and there's just an endless wealth of theological truth that you can derive from this expression. And I, as you know, in the chapter, I go into some of that richness of meaning. But it's simply a phrase that's always been there in every extant manuscript we have of the Roman canon, going back to the earliest centuries of which we have records. It's always there. It's never absent. So this is something extremely ancient. And St. Thomas Aquinas, for instance, he said it comes from the Apostle Peter. I think basically he just has the instinct of the medievals that anything that we've always done must go back to the apostles. Well, it might very well, because it's always been there, and it's never been absent. And there are plenty of other things in the liturgy where you can find a first century where it appears, for the first time. And so the thing that I talk about is not only how precious these words are and how much meaning they have, but also then I have a whole chapter about where I go into detail about how the liturgical reformers simply removed the words from the formula of consecration of the chalice. They just, I mean, it's almost incredible when you read what they say.
Yeah.
Their attitude is so rationalistic. Yeah. Oh, this doesn't make sense here. This is an interruption of the formula. It must be some kind of interpolation.
Oh, and we're getting complaints that it's not working in all the languages.
Yeah, exactly. In the vernacular, when we translate when we translate the formula of consecration into the vernacular and we say it out loud, it sounds clunky, it sounds strange. And so, you know what? Let's just get rid of it. And then Paul VI says, wait a minute. No, we can't get rid of that. So we just need to find a different purpose for it. We need to repurpose it. And so then they stick the phrase after the consecration and make it into the priest's appeal for an acclamation from the people. Yeah. And I quote the liturgical reformers saying, let's give the people something to do. I mean, this has never happened in the Roman Rite before. There's never been an acclamation like this after the consecrations. But hey, it's good for active participation. So we'll have the priest say, mystery of faith, and then we'll have the people say, Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again, or something of that sort. The so-called memorial acclamation.
Yeah.
So without going into too much detail, because it's all there in the book, it's an astonishing example of scholars tinkering. Is what I call tinkeritis. They're just they've got this. They treat the liturgy like a machine, and they just take it apart.
Every single rite after this was changed, then like everything from baptism to matrimony, and anything in between, any document.
Exactly. So they treat all of these things not as living organisms, as precious transmissions of the cumulative faith and devotion of the church, which is what they are. But they treat them as machines, as lifeless machines that can be taken apart and reconfigured ad libitum, depending upon the ideas of the architects, of the engineers. And this is a profoundly un-Catholic attitude. Never in the history of the church have we seen this kind of attitude applied to the liturgy.
I've heard in Italian the words "La messa è veramente bella." The Mass is truly beautiful. And as we're talking, I'm having this theme of what's poetic keeps coming back. And the thing about poetry is what's being expressed between everything that's being said and what's happening in the silences and what happens on that pause and what happens on that shift from this thought to that place and everything that happens in the human condition when we experience poetry or music for that matter. And it feels like, as we're having this conversation, it feels like a whole swath of what was poetic and beautiful and reverent and mystical, frankly, the thing that connected us to the Holy Spirit. And I'm not saying it doesn't exist at all. I guess I would put it to you in the form of this question. What have we gained with the new liturgy and the new Mass? What have we gained?
Yeah. So I would say, first of all, I just want to say thank you for your comments about poetry. I think that it's very true. When you look at what is the difference between poetry and prose, poetry is not just about what is said, but about how it is said, and also what is not said. And so the greatness of poetry is speech at its most elevated. It's speech that is straining at the boundaries of the ineffable, right? And sometimes it uses rhyme and rhythm. Sometimes it uses difficult vocabulary. Sometimes it uses confusing syntax or partial incomplete phrases, or it uses all kinds of means in order to gesture at things that words can never say, can never properly convey. And that's exactly how a traditional liturgy works, all of them, Eastern and Western, is that they don't just have a message. It's not just like a memo that needs to be transmitted, right? It's not some kind of freight of information. It's also about how it's said and what is not said, and how we're led beyond the words and beyond the human gestures to the divine mystery. And this is where something like Mysterium Fidei being at the center of the consecration of the chalice, it's telling us something about how pivotal is the Eucharistic sacrifice, how pivotal is the shedding of the precious blood of Christ, by which the world is washed, by which our souls are washed, by which the new heavens and the new earth will be cleansed, right? It's telling us something about that. It's not just a generic announcement of, oh, this is what Christ did in his life, death, and resurrection, which is what it became. That's pedantic. That's superficial. That's not what the role of Mysterium Fidei was, right? So I think what you can see among the liturgical reformers, in addition to the other things I've said, is just an extremely prosaic, pedantic, and superficial understanding of what they were dealing with. As if they never slowed down enough to ponder what they were working with. They didn't have wonder. They didn't have amazement. They did not have humility in front of what they were working with. And that's, somebody once said, I think I quote this, that it's impossible to have knowledge of something unless you approach it with humility. The access to knowledge is barred to the proud. And so when they try, and this is what you see with so much of modern science, modern scientists, materialists, they're blinded by science in that expression. But they actually, what they know in the wrong way, and therefore it makes them more stupid. But getting to your question, no, I don't think we have gained anything. I think we have lost a tremendous amount because of liturgical reform. And that's why I speak as passionately as I do about the need to rediscover and to recover and to fully restore the traditional Roman liturgy. This is a non-negotiable thing. This is not some kind of incidental, secondary, take it or leave it sort of affair. Like, okay, that's your taste. You like chocolate, I like vanilla. No, it's not like that at all. It's something much more radical, much more essential, much more fundamental. And I think you realize that both from studying the matter and from experiencing it. The experience is crucial.
It's very true. And I mean, you do talk about that we're on this sort of 70-year timeline. Can you just go into that just a little bit?
Well, let's just say the book's subtitle, right? Rediscovering the traditional Latin liturgy. Returning to the traditional Latin liturgy after 70 years of exile. That subtitle is referring to a very particular 70 years. I say you could parse it out in two ways. Either 1948 to 2018 or 1951 to 2021. Why? Because 1948 is when Pius XII convened what's called the Pian Commission of liturgical reform, that gave Annibale Bugnini, the main architect of the Novus Ordo, his first Vatican job. And that Pian Commission, which started in 1948, was pivotal in driving forward the Holy Week revisions of Pius XII, followed by the pretty radical rubrical changes and calendrical changes of Pius XII later on in the mid-50s, then the pretty significant rubrical changes of John the 23rd, some of which were terrible. And basically that 1948 commission led right up to the Novus Ordo. I mean, it was the beginning of the end as far as that goes. And so, whereas 2018 was the first year in which the old Holy Week, the pre-55 Holy Week, began to be celebrated more widely and with the official approval of the Ecclesia Dei Commission of the Vatican. Now, I argue in chapter 12 that approval is not at all necessary, but it was helpful. It was helpful for reassuring people that they were moving in the right direction. Although I think that they could know independently that they were moving in the right direction. And so, in a way, 2018 represented a kind of beginning of the reversal of what happened in 1948. That was what I meant by returning after 70 years of exile. 1951 is the year that the experimental Paschal Vigil was first tried out. And 2021, similarly, was a year when it was expected that there would be universal approval from the Ecclesia Dei Commission for the pre-55 Holy Week. That did not happen. But nevertheless, the pre-55 Holy Week continues to be celebrated, and it will not ever cease. I mean, we're not going to be able to roll this back. The momentum is there, and the knowledge is there, and the energy and the dynamism is there.
Yeah. No, I feel that sense as well. And by participating in this liturgy, you are repointed towards the angels and the saints and feast days and important moments like Lent and Advent and all of the holidays throughout the year, all of the joys we have to celebrate. And we just came past All Saints' Day. I had the thought that we spend so much time honoring soldiers and, fallen soldiers, yet All Saints' Day comes around and we don't actually honor our saints in that way.
Yes. In fact, just along those lines, Saint Mechtild of Hackeborn, fairly unknown medieval mystic. She's known to people who are interested in medieval mysticism, but she wrote in one of her books that the whole court of heaven rejoices when they hear on earth the same words being spoken that they themselves prayed when they were on earth, right? And I always think about that in connection with the traditional liturgy, right? And the divine office, especially, that when I'm praying the hour of prime and I'm reciting these wonderful psalms in their translation by Saint Jerome, which so many centuries of saints have prayed, right? Those saints in heaven are rejoicing. They're like, yeah, we prayed that too. That's our prayer, And of course, if we pray the Psalms in a different translation, it's not cut off. It's not unrelated. But I think there's something very, very powerful about having on our lips the very words that so many saints had on their lips, and by which they praised and adored God.
Yeah, and I want to thank you for taking so much time to speak to me about these very important issues and for teaching in a way. But I just want to ask you, what do you want all Catholics to take away from reading and studying this work that you've created?
I think what would be most important. Two things would be important. The first is to rediscover the dignity of liturgical prayer. I think that liturgical prayer that is to say, the formal, public, social worship of the mystical body of Christ. I think it has been undervalued for such a long time because it's been so played with and abused and manipulated and turned into almost like a political football that most Catholics, if they still practice their faith, they might they might tend to see the liturgy as either a hoop that you need to jump through, or just a kind of social routine, or an opportunity to see your friends, or whatever it might be, maybe an opportunity to hear a good homily, hopefully, or something like that. But they've kind of lost the sense that the liturgy is the moment in our lives when we are caught up with the angels and saints in heaven in praising and glorifying God, and that we are receiving the most potent channels of grace. The streams of grace that flow from the sacraments and from the liturgy are unlike anything else in our lives. That is where the fountain is that we should be drinking from. And so to recover this sense of the centrality and the majesty of the liturgy, such that we could build our lives on it and around it, right? I think that's been lost by Catholics, and they need to rediscover that. And the traditional liturgy is a huge help. It almost pushes us in that direction. And then finally, the other thing is just what we should all want, which is to make God the center of our lives, as it says in the Litany of the Sacred Heart, that it says that the heart of Jesus is the king and center of all hearts. Right? This is what the liturgy is supposed to teach us and help us to live out, as well as our personal devotions. And that's something that we all need to remember.
The book is The Once and Future Roman Rite. I've been speaking with its author, Dr. Peter Kwasniewski. Peter, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today.
Oh, you're welcome. It was delightful, David.
You have been listening to The Way is Love on the Focusing Way podcast. Like, comment, and subscribe on YouTube. Or go to thefocusingway.com and subscribe for bonus content and extras.